In today's lecture, we are going to talk about a new topic or new section, actually, rather. So up to now, we have discussed about the ecology of individual organisms, right? Where we discuss about the how individuals respond to environmental changes by physiological changes, behavioral changes, or even sometimes anatomical changes, but mainly to physiological and behavioral changes, right? But since we already know in ecology, we are going to talk about the interactions, right? It's not the individuals, but sometimes some groups has to cope with the environment, especially the populations, right? In today's lecture, we're going to discuss a little bit further on the how the populations, right? How populations respond to the environmental changes and how do they interact one another in a population, right? Since we are all biologists, you know what is a population. I'm not going to define these terms, but so previously we discussed about the individual characteristics, like what are the individuals' characteristics and the how individuals develop, grow, something like that. But in this session, we will talk on the population characteristics, rather not the individuals, but population. Even the numbers, we will talk about the number in a population, their sex ratio, the population processes and how population grow. Right? Previously, we discussed about how individual grow, but in this case, how population grow. Right? So in the home page, even you can see there is some connections. But you see population ecology, and then if you put together with population genetics, then it will become population biology. But actually here in the ecology, we are going to talk about the population ecology, but maybe in your biology lessons, perhaps you will talk about the population biology. We have to discuss with the linkage with the genetics, right? But so we will restrict to the population ecology with our available time, right? So, right. So population ecology, as I mentioned before, it's the study of the interaction within populations, right? So we can call this as the intra-specific interaction, right, within the individuals in the population, right? So we'll be looking at the how the population size change over time, right? With the time, how these parameters change. There are so many parameters to be considered, right? The size of population, the density, their dispersal pattern, right, which I will explain later on, their demographics, especially the age structure, how their ages are spaced in a population, right, and then the growth of a population. There are other population characteristics, something like a dispersal, migration, invasiveness. Like there are so many things to discuss under this population ecology, right? We'll see how well we can do it within the available time, right? So why population ecology important, right? The population in general, I mean, number of individuals in the population has many things to say, right? For example, for a endangered species like elephant, right? So we have to increase their number, if they are to be survived, so if they are to be protected, then we have to increase their number within a population. But on the other hand, if that species is invasive one, right? For example, here it's the fish, right? This knife fish, chitala or nata, or the knife fish. In this case, you have to keep the population low. You see how this can be important, right? Sometimes you have to consider to increase the populations, whereas sometimes you have to reduce the population size. Right? So based on your conservation or management strategies, you have to limit the numbers or the increase or limit the numbers, right? So there are many things related to the populations, right? Because the populations are the unit of evolution, right? Not, it is not the individuals, right? The evolution happen within a population, right? So that is the unit of a population, the evolution, right? Then its populations are always like change in their numbers. We call it as dynamic, right? The population is not something stable, like doesn't remain the same, change all the time. But with all these changes, they have to maintain some sort of a pattern or the rhythm, which is very important for that population survival. So any changes in the pattern may cause a lot of issues, right? So that's why we have to learn a little bit about the population, right? So if you talk about the population characteristics, so what kind of characteristics do they have in a population, right? The one of the very important thing is a population size. We call N, or the number, right? How many individuals in a defined area in a given time, right? So population size, you have to give the number and in which area, as well as in what time, right? So just giving a number has no any meaning. That number has to be considered with the area. Where do they have this population, and what time or what time frame? I have given here an example. That's the elephant population in Uddavalava National Park, right? Right, that's number is here, right? And in a particular year, right? 2011, right? The other parameter is population density, right? How many individuals per unit area? This is very important, just to see how spatially distributed they, right? In this case, the same population, right? The elephants, right? Here, UNP, and not that elephant in the UNP, that the political part, right? This is UNP is for the Uddavalava National Park, right? Not that UNP, not that elephant, right? This is a real elephant, right? So you can see here the same population, that's N equals 16 here, that they can be in a different volume, in a different area. That means the density is different here and here. Its density is higher here, whereas the density is low here, right? So even though the same population, so it's not the population size alone, then you have to think of the density as well, how dense they are spreaded. And then that's also very important in many cases, right? Right. So just to get an idea whether they are abundant or they are very rare, or whether they are overpopulated, you need to consider their density, right? Just having like a number of elephants, right, in Sri Lanka. Now some people arguing that we have more elephants than what is the environment is supported, right? But that's something we need to discuss. Maybe we can discuss these things later on, right? Okay, now this the key population characteristics, something like a population size. There are many factors that determine the population size, right? So some of these population size determinant factors, they can be density dependent, right? So it all depends on the densities. For example, some factors like a food availability, availability of space. So they all depend on the density. Now, if there is small amount of food, but if the number of individuals are low, then that's fine. But if there is small amount of food and if the density is very high, so that's going to be a problem. Similarly, even for the space, right? So these kind of like food availability, space, Um, competition, likewise, many parameters, they are depend on the density or right density dependent population determinant factors. The other factors called density independent growth, right? Parameters, right? It's not really growth, but the density independent parameters, population growth parameters, right? So, for example, temperature, a flood, or any natural disasters, storm, fires, this kind of thing. It doesn't matter what is the number, right? Even one individual or thousands. So that's going to affect similar way, right? If the going to be a flood, right? So it's going to affect everybody, even it's 1 or 1,000, right? So hope you can get idea the density dependent parameters versus density independent parameters, right? So, right, as you can see here, the density dependent factors, something like the competition for resource or the space, right? You can see here, they are very close one another, right? So their number can determine by the density, right? You might have noticed that this the penguins, right? Even you can see here as a flock or they are together, but sometimes if you watch them very closely, you will see still they keep some distance, but many cases they keep some distance, right? Just to avoid the competition between individuals, right? I will come to this later on, right? So still they have to compete for this resources and speed. So density might affect their population, the how they are spatially distributed, right? And another important character in the population, one of the population characteristics is the demographics. That is something to related to the age, sex, and then this kind of a thing. The sex ratio is going to be a very important parameter. The male to female percentage, right? That proportion is very important. So usually it's close to 50 or 1:1. But in some cases, there can be very different male to female ratios. For example, in the wasp, the common wasp, the female to male proportion is 20:1, right? So right, one male will be among 20 females, right? So there will be a huge competition for males, right? There may be males can be very demanding, right? Right. So the sex ratio is very important, especially even some fish, and some even the reptiles. I know sometimes their sex, male or female sex, will determine by the environmental temperature. You know, changes in temperature will change the male into female or female into male. So these kind of things going to be a really big issue. You know, sometimes the global warming and some of the things might affect even the sex ratios. I know, you know, there will be huge competition in this case if the sex ratio going to change. That will badly affect the population, right? I hope you can get idea from here. And the age structure, like the age structure, like how many individuals in one particular age group. Like for example, in the first year university, that you have one age structure, and second year there'll be more or less another age structure, right? And this is very prominent in a school, right? Because the university you have, I mean, maximum different 4 to 5 years, but in a school you will have grade 1 to 12, 13. So grade 1, how many of them, and in grade 12, how many of them, their sizes, their height, there will be huge differences with their age. So age structure, like how many individuals in a particular age are there? That also very important determinant factor. You see, In the next slide, you can see we call the age structure diagram or age structure distribution diagram. You see the 0 to 15 or 0 to 14, or we can call them as the premature. And this is mature or more reproductive stage and post-reproductive stage. So how many of them are premature or pre-reproductive, and how many of active reproduction, and how many of them post-reproductive? So these factors determine the populations. If there are too many of pre-reproductive and too many of post-reproductive individuals, right, too many of them and very few reproductive stage, then that population going to reduce. At the same time, if there are few pre-reproductive, like this kind of a situation, then their population going to decline over time. Right? If it is something like this will have a stable population and pretty much same population over and over. But if it is something like this, just like what is having in many Asian countries, in Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, Taiwan, even China, not now China actually. Most of the Asian countries have this kind of expanding populations because they have more reproductive age individuals as well as pre-reproductive. When they come to here, so they're going to have huge population sizes, right? So this age structure diagrams is a very good indication how their population is going to be in the future, right? So we will discuss these things later on a little bit further, because the young population, they can grow very fast, right? Than the adult population, so they can become reproductively active quite soon than the other one. So these kind of things has to be considered in a population characteristic, right? Another thing within a population, actually the mode of reproduction. There are different modes of reproduction, which you already know. That's binary fission, right? So binary fission, then we have the sexual reproduction. So it can be hermaphroditism or gonochoristic, right? Hermaphroditism is both male and female organs in the same organism, and then it's the gonochoristic, separate sexes, just like we. All these are different changes. Then there can be parthenogenesis as well in some cases. Some insects, some wasps, especially some insects, they're having this kind of a parthenogenesis as well. So all these reproductive modes also very important for keeping the population sizes, right? We can discuss these things, right? Right. So that is reproductive mode, right? So what kind of a reproductive mode they have? Now the other thing is reproductive episodes. You know the term episode, like in a movie, like a series. Discuss how many episodes or how many volumes. Like even the reproduction can be a single episode or multiple episode, right? So something like a single episode we call semalparity, right? During the lifetime, they will reproduce only once, right? Once they will reproduce and they will die after that. Many insects you might have seen that when they get to their reproductive stage, they will come out and lay eggs or produce their offsprings, and the adults will die thereafter, right? So this is very common in the some insects like meru, and this fish, very famous salmon fish, they have one reproductive event, right? The salmon fish, and that kind of a reproductive episode we call semalparity, right? So they have one single reproductive event throughout their life. whereas the others are called heteroparative, where they might have consecutive several reproductive episodes. For example, most of the mammals and most of the animals having this kind of a several reproductive episodes, which is we call the heteroparative, right? Just the terms, right? You will learn these things maybe a stage. You just need to keep the terms. You should familiar with these terms, right? And there's another thing we call the clutch size, right? Clutch size is the how many offspring they produce, right? I mean, during a reproductive event, how many individuals they are going to produce is the clutch size. Like for example, for human, usually the clutch size is 1, sometimes can be 2, 3, even 5, 6. It's very rare, but it's more of the cases 1, even the elephants. But you know that there are some fish and many insects, they produce thousands of eggs sometimes. So the clutch size is extremely high, whereas the many mammals, they have very small clutch sizes, right? So all these are some unique characteristics of individuals within a population, right? And from that, the death rate, or this, right? How do they die? Do they die on the same rate throughout their lifetime, or do they die at early stage of their life, or do majority of die later stage of their lifetime, right? And that also very good, very important determinant factor that determine the population size, right? And that number of organisms survive, right? And that is we call the survivorship or survivorship curve. How many number of individuals or number of organisms surviving after given period of time, and that is called survivorship. And then if you can draw a sort of a graph or a curve to see the survivorship, we call it as the survivorship curve. Let me show a survivorship curve, right? This is what we call the survivorship curve, right? It is of the age on x-axis, the how many individuals surviving in that particular age, right? This is the age, and how many individuals of that age, particular age, is surviving, right? Actually, both age and the survivorship is taken in a log scale, right? I'm not too sure if you can understand why we have to take the log scale, because you know some bacteria or maybe insects, they just survive for a couple of days or even couple of hours. Their survivorship may be very different. And if you put everybody, like from bacteria, insects, fish, and up to mammals, we have to put all these individuals together in a one plot. In that case, we have to use a log scale where we can put everything together, right? So that's why we consider a log scale here, both age and survivorship, the log scale. Rather, actually, the survivorship is in a log scale, right? So in this survivorship curve, there are actually basically 3 types of survivorship in the animal world, right? At least in the organisms, you can see 3 different types of survivorship. And the first one we call the type 1, right? Type 1 survivorship curve, something like this, the red color one, right? You call the late loss, right? As the young or mid age, their survivorship is very high, or their death rate is very low, right? So survivorship, the opposite is the death rate, right? So we take the death rate is very low as young and mid, and after certain age, their death rate is very high. So they, as adult, they die. I mean, this is typical in many mammals, right? So this kind of a survivorship we call the type 1 loss population, right? The second type of survivorship curve called the constant loss type, many birds, even small mammals like uh, maybe some even rats, a squirrel, like a small mammals, some birds, they will have this kind of a constant loss because their survivorship or the death rate pretty much same throughout their lifetime. Right? The same death rate as young, mid-age, or even as old age. Right? They continuously die in the same sort of a similar rate. And that constant loss is a type 2 survivorship or type 2 curve. And the other one is the this kind of the blue line, that is their survivorship is very low as young, or otherwise the death rate is very high as young, and it's improve as they grow older, right? Very high as young, and they when they grow older, their survivorship is very high. And this is very common in like a fish. Most of the fish, their survivorship is very high as adult, but not as young, right? So you might notice that they produce a lot of eggs because of that, because many of the young eggs or the larval stages will die as young, and then because of that they have to produce a lot of larval stages or the eggs, right? Which means their clutch size is very high, right? So hope you got this idea, right? I think you have to a clear concept, right? Clear understanding on this concept. I think I had many questions on this survivorship curve. Many cases you got some confusion on this survivorship. It's something very simple. The only thing you're not trying to understand is what is the concept behind, right? And then you just try to understand that concept, right? Okay. Now, with all these population parameters, the other very important population parameter is we call the population dynamics. Right? Dynamic, the dynamic is how it changes over time, right? Especially the number, how the population's number change over time, right? If you look at this, this image, you can get some clue, some idea about how the population size change, right? So in the middle, you have the population size, and that population, I mean, if it is the present population size, so that population size can increase by birth, which will add more individuals to the population, and immigration. Any newcomers from a different population, a different group, or different area, if they come to this area and join the population, that their population size will increase, right? So births and immigration. On the other hand, immigration, right? This is immigration, right? IMMI, and this is immigration, EMI, going out of a country or location where they live, right? So if someone come into Sri Lanka, we call immigration. Right? If you are going out, we call immigration. So immigration and the deaths will reduce the population size. Right? So this is very simple statistics. The population size will determine by the births, immigration, which will add individuals to the population, immigration, and death rate, or how many individuals die, or the survivorship will determine how many individuals going to lose. And these four factors will determine actually the population size in the next time, year after, or maybe after 5 years or 10 years. In a given period of time, the population size will determine by number of births, immigration and death, right? So this is actually very simple equation. And then when we talk about the population ecology, there can be small sort of a calculation to determine the population size. A lot of biology students, they struggle a little bit with these calculations. We are not very interested on calculations. So that's why some of biologists, they don't like the population ecology, because it's something to do with the numbers. But it's not always, there are many theoretical things in the population ecology as well, but there are some numbers as well. Of course, in sometimes it can be very complicated numbers as well. But let's see how we are going to deal with this population size, right? Right. So now, so that's where the population ecologists, or the ecologists, or if they are population ecologists, they have a major role to play by determining the population size, right? They have to calculate the population size. How the population size is going to be next year, next 5 years, or next 10 years, next 25 years, next 50 or 100 years. Especially if you're thinking of conservation of particular species, then you have to think of you have to model, because we don't know how it's going to be in the future, and you have to use some sort of model, right? You know what is meant by a model, right? It's a sort of a mathematical equation or graphical something, or some computational thing that you determine how would be the population size in the future. So that kind of thing called the model is basically a mathematical estimation, right? And estimation how the population behaves in the future, right? And to determine that, you need the basic parameters that we discussed before. That is the immigration and birth, where add individuals to the population, and immigration and death, where the individuals remove from the population. So all these, the balance of these four will determine the population size, right? I don't think that this is something difficult, right? Well, so let's see how it goes, right? Now, we put a small equation here. Now, this is the case, when biology see this kind of equation, that's where they start struggling. Oh, this equations, I'm not good at solving this equation, right? But these are nothing but it's just very simple equation, right? Just to calculate the change in population size, that we already know that the population size is determined by the immigration and birth, which add individuals, and immigration and emigration and death, which remove the individuals from the population. And we just put that one into an equation, right? So the population growth rate, right? How the change of population in the given period of time, we can call it as a growth rate, right? I have put R here just to say the rate of growth, and that is determined by number of births, the birth rate minus death rate. What is the rate? I mean, we can consider as a number or rate, like if it is a rate, right, for 100 people, so 1,000 people, how many births, and how for 1,000 people, how many deaths, right? So if you like looking at the statistics in hospitals, for example, they always take these as the rates, right? Like a number of births, they always for 1,000 individuals, right? So next time you go to a website, like a hospital data, they always consider as a rates, birth rate, how many births for 1,000 people in that population. That's the birth rate. And the same, similarly, death rate is the how many deaths per 1,000 people. Right? That become a rate. Right? And birth rate minus death rate plus immigration minus emigration, right? So you reduce the birth rate from the death rate and immigration from immigration, and you get the growth rate. So you can get the idea about the population growth, right? I hope this is not something complicated, right? It's something very simple, right? This R actually, though we call it as the growth rate, but of course, this will have different meaning actually. I will come to that one later on. This R has another meaning as well, but which we can discuss later on, right? So R, the growth rate equals birth rate minus death rate. And we have to add that one, the immigration minus immigration, and the balance will be the population growth rate, right? So this is, hope you are clear with that, right? So as I mentioned before, births and deaths usually expressed as a rate rather than like how many births has no any meaning, if you say one birth or two births, but it has to be a rate, like for 1,000 individuals, how many births? So that become a rate, right? And we call the birth rate or the natality rate, whereas the death rate or the mortality rate, right? The natality rate was mortality rate, right? Now, for a population where there is no immigration of the emigration, right? I hope you have done this kind of a small calculation in your advanced level. For a population where there is no immigration and emigration, so keep in mind the Mendel's laws. Mendel ke law wala mataka tine immigration nahi kila hitala calculations kara. Similarly, there is no in a particular population, if there is no immigration or emigration, and in that population, growth rate will be determined by the birth rate minus death rate, right? Because there is no immigration or emigration. Like for many populations, if it is elephant population in a particular area, usually you won't have any immigration and emigration. I mean, seldom there can be, but not always. For that population, the growth rate will be determined by the birth rate minus death rate, right? Hope this is clear. It's not something confusing, right? Right. So the growth rate, the population size or the population growth rate will determined by birth rate minus death rate, right? Now, in the organisms, actually in the biosphere, in the animal organisms, actually there are two type of population growths, right? So at least in an idealized way, I mean, ideally there are two form of growths, two type of growth actually in a population, right? Again, it's a population, right? Not in an individual growth. In a population, there are two type of growth, population size growth, right? That one of them we call the exponential growth, right? Exponential growth. In Sinhalese, it's called Gathiya Vakre, right? So it's even difficult. You just keep in mind it's the exponential growth. It's more or less J shape. Right? It's not really J, but it's like it looks like a J. Right? The J-shaped growth curve we call the exponential growth. And the second type called the logistic growth, Pravardhana Vakre, or S-shaped growth rate, right? Feel some some of you might think it's something very complicated. It is not, right? It's something very simple. I will explain these things later. Right. So exponential versus logistic growth. These are the two different types of growth that we can seen in usually in many populations, right? So there can be changes, but I mean, in ideally or idealized situation, we will have this kind of two population growth, right? What scientists have found is that the population size, we know that there are 4 parameters: the death rate, birth rate, the immigration and migration are the main parameters that determine the population size. But at the same time, there are the important parameters that's called the size of the population, right? At the present, population size is also very important to determine how many individuals going to be in the future. For example, if it is like in a particular country, if there is only very few individuals, that their population will be decline very sharply than a country where they have a large population, because the number of individuals in a population is a very good indication how that population is going to be in the future. So that's why we are worried about like some of the endangered animals. When their populations going very low, we are bit scared that their population will be vanished, or where they will be endangered, or they will be eliminated from the world. So that's, we have to keep a minimum number. So population size is one factor that determines the growth rate, the population growth. And there's another thing, that is all the population have a natural tendency, right? The population has a natural tendency whether to increase their population sharply or to increase their population very slowly, right? We know that, for example, rats or some insects, even the flies, the mosquitoes, we know that their numbers increase very sharp, right? When there is a small change in the weather, the mosquito number going to increase sharply. But how about the mammals, right? Tigers, leopards, their population sizes, they are keeping very low. And this is one of the reason is their natural tendency. There is a biological tendency whether that population will increase very sharply or not, right? So that is called the term which is called actually the biotic potential. That is a sort of a natural potential for them to grow their by population size, right? So I'll explain this in a little bit later in more detail. You might think a little bit too much at this stage, but these terms are very important. We can discuss a bit further, right? So keep in mind again, the birth rate, death rate, the immigration and immigration are important parameters. But at the same time, in the long run, right, for every population, definitely all these parameters are important. But in the long run, what is more important is this population size. What is the population size now? And what is their biotic potential? What is their natural capacity to increase their numbers? So these two factors are also very important in determining the population size in long term, right? So population growth rate will determine pretty much on this population size, as well as the capacity for them to grow, right? At that one, right? So the change in population size, right? The change in population size over time, right? With the time, how their population size going to be increased, actually will be proportionate to their number, right? Again, come to this one. the population size, as in the population growth rate, will pretty much depend on the N, that's a capital N, that's the number. That is the proportionate to the population size, right? The population increase rate or the population growth rate, that is, the delta sign is used for any change in the number and the present number, any change in number will over the time, right? Any change in number over time, that's the change in time, it's proportionate there the population size, that is the N, capital N. And I think you have done some mathematics course as well, but even in the advanced level, you know how to make a proportionate, how to remove a proportionate mark, right? If you can multiply that proportionate mark by a constant, and you can make it equal, right? You can remove that proportionate mark and make it equal by multiplying this with a constant, right? So in this case, the change in number over time, we can make it equals R into N, right? That is the constant we use to multiply here to remove this proportionate mark, right? And this R is something very unique, right? So this R called the intrinsic rate of increase, that is the natural tendency for that particular population to increase. Something similar to what I mentioned before, the capacity for the population to increase. At the maximum capacity for that population to grow, that is called R max, or actually that is actually called the biotic potential, right? That is the maximum capacity that population can grow, and that term we call the biotic potential, right? Okay, so now you see this is where some biology students struggle with this population ecology, because there are some small equations, but these are very simple equations, to be honest. If you can understand these things so as a concept, and it's so easy. But anyway, if you didn't understand anything, I will explain later on a bit further. But with that, let me conclude today's session, and then we will meet again in the next week, where I will discuss further into these the population growth and different types of population growth, right?